The alias was Miss Williams, and she had been practicing it for 2 weeks. Not the name itself. Names were easy. She'd had plenty of them over 7 years at Hogwarts. It was the rest of it. The walk, the pace, the particular quality of forgettable ordinariness that a Miss Williams would carry in the set of her shoulders and the angle of her chin. Too high and you got interesting. Too low and you got timid. A Miss Williams, newly appointed to St. Gregory's Primary School in Little Whinging, Surrey, would walk at exactly the right height to be forgotten about before the lunch bell, and she had spent 2 weeks getting that height calibrated to the centimetre. Nymphadora Tonks walked at that height now, and it was the most difficult thing she had done all morning. It was the 2nd of September, 1990, and the sky above Little Whinging had the bleached-out quality of an English summer that wasn't quite finished sulking. The houses were identical. That was the first thing she noticed about this place. The absolute uniformity of them. Each lawn trimmed to the same anxious length. Each car reversing from the same kind of driveway at the same kind of hour. She had grown up in a house that leaned slightly to the left and smelled of her mother's experimental cookery, and had a garden her father described as enthusiastic. Little Whinging had made its feelings about enthusiasm extremely clear. She kept her face easy and untroubling. Brown hair, a soft, forgettable brown, shoulder length, pinned at the nape with a plain clip. Brown eyes, which were not quite her natural colour, but close enough that holding them required only background effort, the way you might keep one hand on a door that wants to swing. A face that was pleasant without being remarkable. She'd practiced it in the bathroom mirror of the let flat on Spinner's Row until she found the combination that read as young primary school teacher and not as 17-year-old doing something she wasn't old enough for. The ministry brief had been 3 pages and a handshake from a supervisor whose name she hadn't been given. Subject, Harry James Potter. Date of birth, 31st July 1980, currently residing at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Assess welfare and living conditions. Weekly reports to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement via secure channel. Maintain cover identity at all times. Make no direct contact with the subject. It had not mentioned that she would be the youngest person in the building by 6 years, or that she would need to teach fractions. The school came into view as she turned off the high street. It was a 2-story brick building with a painted sign by the gate. St. Gregory's Primary School, in cheerful yellow letters someone had touched up recently, and a concrete yard with a red climbing frame and a row of wheelie bins. She went in through the staff entrance and introduced herself to the school secretary, and collected her lanyard, and found her classroom without any significant incident, which she counted as a victory. She sat at the teacher's desk and laid out her folders, and told herself she was fine. By 9:15, the children were beginning to arrive, and she watched them without appearing to watch, which was a skill she was fairly confident she'd arrived with. Most came in the clusters of end of summer, pairs and small groups picking up where they'd left off, existing next to each other with the ease of people who had never been made to question their right to company. There was a large, fair-haired boy who came in with what appeared, by any reasonable assessment, to be an entourage. He walked with the particular solidity of someone who had always occupied exactly as much space as he wanted, and had never been given a reason to reconsider the arrangement. The other children arranged themselves around him with the attentiveness of small planets around a large and self-satisfied sun. The boy behind him was not part of the arrangement. He was small, not the compact smallness of a short child, but a different kind, the kind that spoke of having been given just slightly less than enough for long enough that it had begun to tell. His school trousers were too large in the waist and too long at the ankle, turned up in a fold that suggested improvisation rather than care. The jumper above them was several sizes too big, the sleeves coming down past his wrists so that only his fingers showed. He had black hair that had clearly been making its own decisions for some time and had no intention of starting to consult anyone. Round glasses, their bridge held together with a strip of tape. A thin face, and in it a pair of very green eyes that moved over the yard with an alertness he was trying, not entirely successfully, to make look like nothing at all. He walked slightly apart from the other children, not with the studied separateness of someone making a point, just apart, the space around him maintained by means that required no visible effort from its architect. As the fair-haired boy passed through the doors, he glanced back once, and the children nearest him glanced back too, and then they all turned away together, and the message was sent without a word spoken. The boy with the glasses had already stopped looking. He turned toward the entrance with his bag on his shoulder, and his face arranged into a patient and absolute neutrality, and went inside. 3 lessons passed. She knocked over a pencil cup during morning registration and walked into the corner of a desk during the second period, but recovered from both without drawing comment, and by 11 o'clock had 2 children ignoring the lesson and 1 asleep at the back, which she understood was standard. At lunch, she sat at the far end of the hall with a cup of tea she did not drink and a folder of marking she did not open, and watched. Harry Potter sat at the end of a long table with approximately 18 inches of empty bench on either side of him. He had a school dinner on his tray, something beige and peas, and he was eating it with a methodical attention that suggested he was concentrating on the food rather than thinking about anything else. Nobody spoke to him. The children near him were not unfriendly in any active sense. They simply behaved as though the space he occupied did not quite exist. Toward the end of the lunch period, a girl from the year below started moving along the bench toward the empty space beside him, carrying her tray with the focused expression of someone navigating a decision they hadn't finished making. She had almost reached him when Dudley Dursley moved into the aisle between them, not aggressively, not with any obvious purpose, just moved, the way large things move, and the girl reconsidered. She changed direction and found somewhere else to sit, and did not look back. Tonks watched him watch it happen. He did watch it. His eyes tracked the girl's change of course with a brief, clear attention, and then he looked back down at his tray and ate another forkful, and his face settled back into the same careful neutrality it had worn all morning. He did not look wounded. He looked, with a precision that did something unexpected to the space behind her sternum, entirely accustomed to it. She walked home through the same streets and the same uniform lawns, and sat down at the small desk in the flat on Spinner's Row and opened her DMLE reporting pad and wrote, in her neatest professional hand, "Subject presents as physically healthy and alert, with apparent normal cognitive development for age. Social integration appears impeded by factors external to subject. Observed clothing is oversized and of poor fit, consistent with hand-me-down garments. Preliminary assessment indicates grounds for continued observation." She stared at that for a moment. Then she took out the second notebook, the private one, not intended for any official file, and wrote, "His glasses are held together with tape. His sleeves came down over his hands all day, and he never pushed them up. So I don't think they fit, and I don't think he's tried to fix it. I couldn't see whether he'd brought anything from home for lunch." She paused, then added, "He sat alone for the entire lunch period. No one sat with him." She closed the notebook and went to make herself a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the back wall of the neighboring garden while the kettle boiled, and thought about nothing in particular for quite a long time. The report arrived on the desk of the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement on a Friday afternoon in the first week of September, sealed with standard ministry blue wax and stamped with a routing code Amelia Bones recognized as originating from the Covert Operations Registry. She had authorized the routing herself 4 weeks ago, when a particular request had come across her desk through channels she could not, quite, have explained to anyone who asked. She broke the seal. The report was 3 pages in a neat, unpracticed hand, the hand, she had already decided, of someone who had learned to write carefully because they had not yet written enough to make it automatic. The heading read, Preliminary Observation. Week 1. Subject H.J. Potter. Operative W. Amelia Bones adjusted the monocle at her right eye and set the first page flat on her desk, and read. She was a square-jawed woman with close-cropped grey hair, and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from discipline, from having spent years deciding what to let show and what to hold back, and having gotten very good at both. Subject, Harry James Potter. Date of birth, 31st July 1980. Current address, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Guardians, Vernon and Petunia Dursley. Maternal aunt. Parents, James Fleamont Potter and Lily Potter, née Evans. Deceased 31 October 1981. The operative's physical observations were orderly. The subject was small for his age, below average height and weight for a 10-year-old male. Clothing consistently oversized and ill-fitting, consistent with hand-me-down garments. Spectacles worn. Frames repaired with adhesive tape. No evidence of social integration observed. Subject eats alone during school lunch periods. Apparent social exclusion maintained by external peer pressure from one Dudley Dursley, resident of the same household. She turned to the second page. The observations continued in the same careful hand. The subject had not spoken to any peer during the observed period, except when directly addressed. He had answered a classroom question correctly, and then appeared to gauge the reaction of the children around him before he showed any expression. He had eaten his lunch quickly and without apparent pleasure. The operative had added a personal note at the bottom of the 3rd page, below the official section headings. It was in a faster, less considered hand, the kind that happens when someone gives up trying to be precise and says the thing directly. I could not determine whether he ate before the school dinner. The lunch portion appeared small. He sat alone for the entire period. No one sat with him. Amelia set the report down. Then she picked up the department telephone and asked the records room to send up the improper use of magic trace file for 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. It arrived in 11 minutes, delivered by a junior clerk who handed her the folder without comment. The folder was thicker than she had expected. The oldest entry was dated June 1985. Hair regrowth incident. The subject's hair had been cut extremely short by the Guardian. By morning, it had returned to its prior length, with no magical adult present at the time of the incident. The ministry had logged it, classified it as spontaneous underage accidental magic, and filed it. September 1987. Clothing incident. A jumper placed on the subject by the Guardian had shrunk to unwearability during the process of being put on. Subject age 7. Trace registered and filed. March 1989. A teacher at the subject's school had experienced an involuntary change of hair color, proximate to a confrontation involving the subject. Subject age 8. Trace registered. Muggle-worthy excuse committee notified. Filed. May 1989. Subject had been found on the roof of the school kitchen building following a confrontation with other students in the yard. No explanation, given that satisfied the school's head teacher. Trace registered. Muggle-worthy excuse committee notified. Incident attributed to unsupervised roof access. Filed. 2 further incidents of lesser severity. Then the file ended, because the improper use of Magic Officer's remit was to log and classify and determine whether prosecution was warranted, and in the case of an underage child who had not yet received a Hogwarts letter, the answer to that question was always no. The incidents were recorded, and the incidents were filed, and nobody had asked what they meant about the conditions producing them. She closed the folder. Together, the two documents made a picture that the Ministry had been looking at for 5 years and had never chosen to look at as a whole. A child was living at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He did not know what he was. He was wearing his cousin's discarded clothes. He sat alone at lunch. And 5 separate times in the past 5 years, something impossible had happened to him or near him, and the Ministry had recorded it and filed it and done absolutely nothing else. His name was Harry Potter. 9 years ago, he had survived something no one was supposed to survive, and the wizarding world had been calling him the boy who lived ever since, which had always struck Amelia as a peculiar kind of tribute, the kind you gave to someone when you wanted to celebrate them without actually doing anything useful for them. The wizarding world had sent him flowers, in a manner of speaking, and then gone home. She placed the folder on top of the report and looked at both of them, and did not make a sound. The memo arrived 3 minutes later via the standard interdepartmental paper aeroplane system. It unfolded itself on the corner of her desk, and she read it without picking it up. The Minister for Magic's office wished to inquire whether DMLE operational resources were being applied to a matter involving Muggle welfare and civilian children, as this would appear to fall outside the department's standard jurisdiction, and if so, whether the head of DMLE might provide a brief summary of the operational objective and the authorizing senior official. Cornelius Fudge had been in office for 3 months. He communicated through inquiries rather than directives, which was a particular kind of politics. It meant that whatever came next would be a response to his question rather than a defiance of his order, and the distinction mattered enormously to him. She had met him twice. He was a man who disliked discomfort and had arranged a career in which he encountered it as infrequently as possible, and a DMLE report documenting the conditions in which the boy who lived was being raised by his Muggle relatives would constitute a significant quantity of discomfort for anyone who had to decide what to do about it. The authorizing official for the operation was a senior supervisor within her own department, whose name was not on the memo and would not be, because that was how her department ran its covert deployments, and Fudge knew it. His inquiry was broad enough that it could not be refused on procedural grounds, and narrow enough not to require her to confirm anything she was not prepared to confirm. She noted the precision of it and found it unpersuasive. She folded the memo in half and placed it in the tray marked pending, which was not the same as the tray marked actioned, and returned to the trace file. The Ministry's Friday evening corridors had the particular quiet of a building that had mostly emptied. In Little Whinging, Surrey, in a let flat on Spinners Row, a junior operative barely older than the children she was watching was probably sitting at a small desk, wondering whether anyone had read 3 pages of careful handwriting. Amelia had read them. In Little Whinging, the evening was mild and yellowing at the edges, and Tonks was walking home along a different route than she'd taken all week, not for any reason she'd named to herself, just a different turn at the corner. The street she found was quieter. Houses the same as all the others, the front lawns trimmed to the same vigilant standard, and on a garden wall ahead, a grey cat sat with the particular stillness of something that had been waiting rather than resting. It watched her with a quality of attention she would have described, in other company, as remarkable. She slowed without quite stopping. The cat did not blink. It had large amber eyes, and it regarded her not the way a cat watches a bird, with assessment and appetite, but the way a senior colleague might study someone whose credentials they were quietly and carefully checking. She walked on. Behind her, she was reasonably certain, the cat watched her go. 5 weeks in, and she had developed a system. Not a complicated one. The job didn't require complicated. It required consistency. She marked the register at 8:30 and learned 31 names in the first week and got the seating plan committed to memory by the second. She knew which children arrived early and which arrived in a last-minute tumble at the gate. She knew which ones ate everything on their trays at lunch, and which ones traded the things they didn't want, and which one always sat alone at the end of a bench and ate quickly and without looking up. She had learned to carry a marking folder to the window whenever she wanted to stand there, so that standing at the window looked like something else. October had come in overcast and mild, the kind of weather that couldn't quite commit to anything. The classroom smelled of chalk and old carpet, and the particular institutional warmth of radiators that had been running since 1974. Outside, the yard was a rectangle of grey concrete, bordered by a chain-link fence on 2 sides, and the school kitchen building on the third, a flat-roofed annex attached to the main building at a right angle. She knew its geometry the way she knew the seating plan, as data, as a thing it was useful to understand. It was a Tuesday, mid-October, afternoon break. She was standing at the window with her marking folder when the yard filled up. Most of the children spread out into their usual configurations. And then Dudley Dursley came through the door with 3 others at his back, and the yard rearranged itself around him the way it always did. And across the concrete, Harry Potter walked faster. She put her pen down. Not dramatically, just set it down. The geometry of the yard was not, she had already noted, in Harry's favour. The gate was behind Dudley's group. The wall on the left was solid brick. The kitchen annex on the right had a service door that was usually locked, and Harry had already checked it once this week. She'd seen him do it, a quick shoulder test as he passed, and it hadn't opened. That left the chain-link fence at the back, but Dudley's group had fanned out, and the angles were closing. Harry was good at reading the angles. She'd been watching him read angles for 5 weeks. He ran. He made it 3 strides before the largest of the group got a hand on his arm, and then she lost sight of him for a moment as the cluster closed, and then something happened that she had no tactical category for, because the cluster opened again, and Harry wasn't in it. He was on the roof. He was standing on the flat roof of the kitchen annex, approximately 4 meters off the ground, with a look on his face that was in equal parts baffled and desperate, and she knew with complete certainty that he had no idea how he had gotten there. She stood at the window for 2 seconds and processed this. The group in the yard had gone very quiet. The group in the yard was staring up at the roof with the particular frozen quality of children who have just watched something happen that has no name in their experience yet. She had a wand in her cardigan pocket. It was the only magic she was carrying, because Miss Williams didn't carry magic, and Miss Williams was the only person in this building. The International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy had been in effect since 1692, and it meant that she could not produce her wand in a Muggle school yard in front of 27 Muggle children in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. It also meant that any magical incident at the school required immediate concealment. She was already moving. At the door of the classroom, she stopped to pick up the first plausible reason to be going outside. A folder, a piece of paper, anything, and then abandoned that and went anyway. The sound reached her as she came through the ground floor exit into the side passage that connected to the yard. A teacher from the floor above had seen from her window and was already coming down, and the administrator whose office overlooked the front car park had also seen and was making for the side door in the other direction. 60 seconds. That was, she estimated, what she had. She stepped into the shadow of the passage entrance, where she would not be clearly visible from the yard, and drew her wand and cast the Confundus charm twice in quick succession. First at the teacher coming down the far stairwell, then at the administrator reaching for the side door. The charm was not dramatic. It produced no light, no sound. It worked the way a quiet voice works. It found the place where a person was about to make a decision and replaced the decision with a slightly different one. The teacher paused on the landing, looked at her clipboard, and turned back toward her classroom, seized by a sudden conviction that she had left the gas ring on in the staff room. The administrator opened the side door, looked out at the car park, and went to move her car, which she was certain she'd left without the handbrake. 45 seconds now. Tonks put her wand back in her cardigan pocket and walked into the yard at a normal pace. Harry was still on the roof. He had sat down on the flat surface, which suggested he had decided that sitting was safer than standing, which was a reasonable decision, and she noted it. The group of children in the yard had re-established its language. They were pointing, arguing, making sounds that would attract attention in another 40 seconds, whether or not she managed anything. She did not look up at Harry. She looked at the children and said his name in the even, carry-across-a-yard voice she'd spent 2 weeks developing, and told him to come down carefully from there. And then she told the children nearest the door to go and find the head teacher. And she said it in the manner of a person who has already assessed the situation and is managing it, which redirected most of their attention toward obedience rather than novelty. Harry came down from the roof by climbing across to the drain pipe at the corner of the annex and working his way down, which said something about his physical competence that she also noted and would record. He was sent to the head teacher's office. She watched him go. The slightly too large trousers, the dragging sleeves, the deliberately neutral expression back in place by the time the door swung behind him. She stood in the yard for another moment after the door closed, with the marking folder she hadn't needed held under her arm, and then she went back inside and up to her classroom and sat down at the teacher's desk and opened her private notebook. Her observation notes filled 2 pages. She wrote what she had seen clearly and in order. The gang, the angles of the yard, the moment of levitation or apparition or whatever the precise term was for a 10-year-old boy ceasing to be at ground level and becoming present on a roof instead. She wrote what his face had looked like at the moment he understood where he was. She wrote what she had done and why, and noted it as a magic use incident requiring disclosure to the authorizing supervisor, and noted also that the 2 Muggle adults she had confunded would almost certainly have no memory of the decision being strange, because the Confundus charm at low power produced exactly that quality of confused recollection, a sense of having chosen something without quite knowing why, which was indistinguishable from any number of Tuesday afternoons. She did not write in the official notes. He looked frightened when he saw how high up he was. He looked frightened for exactly 2 seconds, and then he stopped looking frightened, and I think that is the thing I am going to think about tonight. She wrote that in the other notebook, in the long corridor of the improper use of magic office at the Ministry of Magic. A registering quill jerked to life at 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and scratched 2 entries on the log in rapid succession. The senior clerk on duty frowned at the parchment and read both entries twice, because they appeared to be from the same address, within 3 minutes of each other, and one was characteristic of accidental underage magic, and the other was characteristic of an adult witch or wizard casting a deliberate charm, and neither explanation made sense if the other was also true. He flagged both entries for review. He did not know what to make of them. That was, in his experience, someone else's job. The registering quill settled. Outside the window of the ministry, London went about its Tuesday. In Little Whinging, Surrey, a boy sat in a head teacher's office and tried to explain something he could not explain, and on the flat roof of a kitchen annex, nothing remained to indicate that anything unusual had occurred at all. The flagged entries sat in the review tray of the improper use of magic office for 2 days before anyone with sufficient authority looked at them. This was not, in the ordinary run of things, remarkable. The IUMO processed roughly 40 incidents per week across Britain, and the review tray moved at the pace of available attention rather than urgency. What was somewhat less ordinary was the notation appended to both entries by the senior clerk who had first seen them: anomalous dual signature, same address, same afternoon, 1 underage accidental, 1 adult deliberate. Requires explanation. The explanation arrived on the 3rd morning in the form of a memorandum from the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, signed in her own hand and stamped with the Covert Operations Registry Code. One of the 2 signatures was the product of an authorized DMLE deployment, details of which were held in the restricted registry. The IUMO was to consider the adult signature accounted for, log it accordingly, and continue tracking all future underage incidents from the address in the normal manner. The supervisor read the memo twice, initialed it, and told his clerk to file both entries as resolved. The clerk, who had spent 2 days in a state of mild professional anxiety about the anomalous notation, and had constructed 3 separate theories as to what might produce a simultaneous adult and underage dual trace from a residential address, filed them without comment. The matter was closed in 9 minutes, which was about as efficiently as an unexplained double trace could reasonably be closed, and the supervisor returned to his tea. 3 floors above, Amelia was reading Cornelius Fudge's 2nd memo. It was longer than the first. The minister expressed himself. She had noticed this tendency, with a certain verbal generosity when the occasion did not require brevity. He wished to convey that it was not his intention to interfere with the operational independence of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, with which he had every confidence and great respect, but that several of his advisers had noted concern regarding what appeared to be scope creep in DMLE welfare initiatives involving Muggle citizens and their domestic arrangements, and whether the current deployment of departmental resources might benefit from a reassessment in light of those concerns, and whether the head of DMLE might wish to brief the minister's office at her earliest convenience. Fudge had been in office for 3 months and was still deciding how directly he was willing to speak. She found this frustrating in the way that only very careful men were frustrating. The memo required her to respond to what he had implied rather than what he had said, and what he had implied was stop. The phrase scope creep was doing a great deal of quiet work in that memo. She read it twice and set it down and thought about it. And what she thought was that a man who communicated primarily through implication was a man who intended to be able to say, later, that he had never issued an order. Her written response took 4 paragraphs. Evidence of a minor's welfare concerns had been documented through authorized operational means and was currently on file within the department. Existing DMLE protocols regarding child welfare required that documented evidence be substantiated before a decision to close an inquiry could be made. The department had not yet completed its substantiation process. She looked forward to keeping the minister's office informed of developments in due course. She did not write. I have read a trace file spanning 5 years. I have read 3 pages in a careful hand about a 10-year-old boy sitting alone at lunch. She sent the memo. 8 weeks in, and the school had settled into the rhythm of an October that had decided, at last, to be properly autumnal. The light through the classroom windows came in at a lower angle now, catching the chalk dust in the air and the smudged prints on the glass, and the radiators had been running long enough that the afternoons were warm and slow in a way that made the children restless. She had stopped being a novelty 3 weeks ago, which meant they had stopped performing and started behaving the way they actually behaved, which was considerably more useful. She had the afternoon register in front of her on a Thursday when she noticed what Harry did with an answer. She had asked a question, something from the board, routine, the kind that had a right answer and required you to think briefly before giving it, and his hand had come up, and she had called on him, and there was a pause before he spoke. Not a long one. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. But in those seconds, his eyes moved to the children on either side of him. A brief, quiet survey of the immediate social landscape before he said the thing he clearly already knew. Then he gave the answer, which was correct, in a voice that was careful not to be too certain about it. She wrote it in her private notebook that evening. He checks before he answers. Not whether he knows, he always seems to know. He checks the children around him first. I think he's checking whether a correct answer is going to be a problem. What made a correct answer a problem was something she could infer from 8 weeks of watching Dudley Dursley's management of the social environment and did not require spelling out. He was still wearing the same clothes she had documented in the first report. Not literally the same garments, presumably, but from the same source, several sizes too large, the sleeves worn rolled at the wrist, the trainers scuffed at the left heel in a way that suggested a previous owner with a different gait. The glasses were the same. The tape at the bridge was still there. She had been noting the clothing in each weekly report because it was the kind of detail that became meaningful as a pattern rather than a single observation. And after 8 weeks, the pattern was clear enough that she found herself having to work at keeping the language of the official reports measured. She composed the second formal report at the desk in the flat on Spinner's Row on a Wednesday evening, rain against the window, her tea cooling at her elbow. It was more detailed than the first. She had more to detail. The roof incident and her response to it. The double trace and its resolution through the IUMO, the classroom dynamics across 8 weeks, the way certain children positioned themselves relative to Dudley's group, the two who had stopped looking at Harry as a social calculation rather than a personal one, the girl in the row by the window who sometimes caught his eye by accident and then looked elsewhere. She included what she had documented professionally and kept the rest for the private notebook, which had developed a tendency to fall open at the same page, because it was the page she returned to most. Walking home on Thursday evening, she took the wisteria walk route without particularly deciding to. The night had the clean, cold smell of autumn settling in, and the street lamps were coming on early. The garden wall was there. The grey cat was on it. She stopped. It had the same amber eyes and the same quality of attention it had turned on her 2 weeks before, that precise, measuring look that had no business being on the face of a cat. She had been thinking about it since the first time, in the way she thought about things that she hadn't yet categorized properly. Not with concern, but with the low-level awareness of a question that was still open. The cat was not watching the bird on the next-door fence. It was not watching the passing car. It was watching her. "Hello," she said, which she acknowledged was not a particularly measured response for a ministry operative on an active covert assignment. The cat held her gaze for another moment. Then, with the unhurried authority of something that had seen what it needed to see. It turned its head and looked at the fence. She took that as dismissal and walked on. Arabella Figg had lived on Wisteria Walk for 11 years, and in that time she had become, as far as her neighbours were concerned, a fixture. A small old woman with too many cats and a tendency to stop people in the street to talk about them. She did not mind this reputation. It was, in fact, precisely the reputation she needed, and she had cultivated it with the same careful attention she gave to everything that mattered. What mattered was the boy on Privet Drive. She had been watching him for approximately 9 years, which had included approximately 9 years of Harry Potter, believing she was nothing more than the peculiar cat lady 2 streets over, who fed him plain biscuits and made him look at photographs of cats he didn't care about. She had shown him albums of every cat she'd ever owned, in chronological order, while providing nothing he might enjoy. She had been scrupulous about it. The most important requirement of her assignment was that Harry never know he was being watched, which meant she could not be anyone he might want to return to, and so she was the sort of person you visited reluctantly and left with relief. She had made peace with this a long time ago. It was the job, and she was good at it. The job, in November 1990, had acquired a complication. It had started in September, the first week of September to be precise, when Tibbles had come home from his afternoon round and sat in front of her armchair with the particular deliberateness that meant he had something to report. Tibbles was the most reliable of her 4 cats for this purpose. He had the highest proportion of nasal blood and the most precise communication of magical detection. What he communicated that September evening was elevated magical residue, not from the direction of Privet Drive, where accidental magic had become sufficiently routine over the years that she tracked it as background noise, but from the direction of the school. St. Gregory's Primary, 2 streets east of Wisteria Walk. Harry was at St. Gregory's. Harry's accidental magic was not a new phenomenon. But this residue was different. Tibbles distinguished between the magic produced by an untrained child with no control and the magic produced by someone who knew what they were doing. And in September, he had distinguished the second type from the vicinity of the school. She had marked it and watched and said nothing to anyone. By October, the reports had accumulated into a pattern. She also had the neighborhood to read, which was a different kind of intelligence. She saw Harry coming home from school each afternoon at 3:45, and she saw what he looked like when he came home, and the relationship between the 2 pieces of information had been one of the steadier anchors of her 9 years on Wisteria Walk. A particular Tuesday in mid-October produced the strongest reading Tibbles had given her in those 9 years. A very brief, very deliberate use of adult magic near the school in the middle of the afternoon, followed within 3 minutes by a spike of accidental underage magic from the same location. That evening, Harry had come home with his trousers dirty, and the carefully arranged expression he always wore when something had happened that he couldn't explain and wasn't going to try. The pattern, by November, was clear. The elevated residue correlated with the presence of a particular individual on the school grounds. The pattern had begun with the new school term. It spiked on days when a young woman whom Figg had begun to follow, at careful distance, walked through the gate at St. Gregory's Primary in the morning and walked back out in the afternoon. She had followed her on a Tuesday, in the 2nd week of November, along Henley Road, and then down past the newsagents, and onto the longer residential route that went nowhere near Wisteria Walk, which confirmed that wherever the young woman lived, it was not in Figg's immediate vicinity. She was plain, brown hair, shoulder length, pinned back, medium height, a sensible coat. She walked at exactly the kind of pace that people walk when they are not going anywhere particularly interesting, which, Arabella Figg had long since learned, was often the pace you adopted when you were trying not to be noticed. She watched the young woman walk 2 full blocks before she accepted what she already knew, which was that there was nothing about her appearance she could use to identify her. The hair was too ordinary. The clothes were too ordinary. The face, which she had managed a clear look at once, from 20 feet on the opposite pavement, was pleasant and thoroughly unremarkable. A plain young woman in her early 20s, perhaps younger. Nobody at a glance. But the cats were not wrong. She had thought carefully about what that meant. A young woman with no distinguishing magical features, who nonetheless set Tibbles's detection at consistent readings on every afternoon she was present at the school. There was one explanation that she kept coming back to, and she didn't like it because it was the most complicated one. That the reason there was nothing to see was because the absence of anything to see was itself the disguise. A perfect disguise. The kind that didn't require effort to maintain, because it was not a concealment applied over the top of something else, but a replacement down to the foundations. The kind that only one specific magical ability could produce and sustain indefinitely. That was not something to decide on lightly. She sat in her kitchen with her cats arranged around her, Tibbles on the mat, Snowy on the ledge, Mr. Paws asleep on the second chair, and laid the bare facts out in her mind with the care she brought to anything that mattered. 9 years of watching, and now, in the 10th year, an unknown magical operative at the school. Not hiding in the ordinary sense, just being someone else, entirely. Watching the same child she was watching, from inside the school. She wrote the letter at the kitchen table that evening with Snowy on the window ledge behind her, and the November wind making itself known around the frame. She wrote what she had observed, and in what order, and the pattern of dates, and the strength of the readings, and her conclusion, and the fact that she could not identify the operative by appearance, because the appearance appeared not to be hers. She wrote it plainly, as she always did, and folded it and addressed it. She had been reporting to Albus Dumbledore for approximately 9 years. She had managed in that time to communicate a great deal through a method that they had long since settled on, and that she had no occasion to question. The letter went where it always went. Then she made herself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about Harry Potter, who was 10 years old and would be 11 in July, and did not know what he was, and who was being watched, as it turned out, from 2 different directions by 2 different people who did not know about each other. This was, she thought, the sort of thing that Albus Dumbledore needed to know about immediately. In the flat on Spinner's Row, 2 streets over, Tonks was writing in her private notebook with a cup of tea steaming at her elbow. She had taken the long route home that evening, as she often did now, out of habit more than reason. The air on Wisteria Walk had smelled of wood smoke and frost. She had not noticed being followed. Her disguise had held through the full day without requiring active effort. It always did, which was the only part of this assignment she was genuinely confident about. She was 17, nearly 18, and she had been Miss Williams for 10 weeks, and the face in the bathroom mirror every morning was still a face she had to choose. She had not noticed the small woman on the opposite pavement, because the small woman had given her no reason to. The 3rd formal report was harder to write than the 2nd. Not because the observations were unclear. They were very clear, and that was exactly the problem. She had filled 3 pages in her official reporting pad, and was still going, and the things she was writing were not vague. They were specific. They were accumulating into a shape that required words she had not, in the first 2 reports, quite let herself use. 2 months in. She picked up her pen. The winter clothing was the clearest evidence. November in Surrey was not severe, but it was not September either, and she had been watching Harry come in through the school gates every morning for 8 weeks, and what he was wearing was not sufficient for the temperature. He had a jacket, grey, fleece-lined, the sleeve cuffs fraying, so large in the shoulders it dragged away from his arms when he moved and let the cold straight in through the gap at the cuffs. She wrote this in the formal report, in the language the formal report required. Subject's outer winter garment appears to be a hand-me-down item in poor fit, resulting gaps in thermal coverage are documented below. And didn't write that she had watched him walk in without flinching, chin tucked down, and had thought about what it meant for an outfit to be doing its best. The lunch was harder to document precisely because the evidence was absence. On some days he had a packed lunch, a single sandwich, often without crisps. On some days he had a school dinner. On 3 occasions in the reporting period he had neither. He had sat with an empty tray and eaten nothing, and she had watched him check the tray once, as though confirming the verdict, and then hold himself still in the way he held himself when his face was not going to do anything it wasn't supposed to. She wrote, "Nutritional provision at school lunch appears inconsistent. Subject was observed on 3 occasions during the reporting period with no lunch provision." Then she added, "No explanation for this absence was observable from my position." She sat back and looked at it. It was the most honestly she'd written in the official file. She was not sure it was honest enough. The thing she couldn't put in the official file was the moment she had watched 3 days ago in the far corner of the yard during morning break. A boy from the year below had tripped on the drain cover at the edge of the concrete, the one that stuck up half an inch, the one everyone who used that corner regularly knew about. He had gone down hard, and the children nearest him had stopped and made uncertain sounds and turned toward the nearest adult who was on the other side of the yard. Harry had reached him before anyone else. She hadn't been tracking him. He was just there, crouched beside the boy, saying something she was too far away to hear. He helped him up and steadied him to the bench near the wall and said one more thing, and the boy almost laughed. He was smiling as he stepped back. A brief, unguarded smile, the first time she had seen it, and she understood immediately why. Dudley Dursley was on the far side of the building and could not see him. Then one of Dudley's group came around the corner, and the smile went away so smoothly it could have been wind. She wrote it in the private notebook, not the official file. She wrote, "He calculates how visible he is before he does anything that would show him doing something kind." I don't know what that means to learn at 10. She was still thinking about it on Thursday afternoon when the back of the classroom became very loud. She was at the board, chalk in hand, facing away from the room in the 3/4 turn that kept the class in peripheral vision. The children were in the restless mode of a Thursday that knew the week was nearly over. She had begun to bring a letter down the board when a tin of pencils came off the shelf at the back of the room, caught on a sleeve and then not caught in time, hitting the floor with a crash and rolling to a stop under a chair. It startled her. She felt the shift before she understood it had happened. Not a thought, but a physical event. The way your arm moves before you've told it to. The disguise was not a conscious effort. It required only the low background attention she maintained without thinking. But the crash went through that attention, like a stone through still water, and for 2 seconds her hair was not brown. She brought it back. She was still facing the board. The chalk was in her hand. She turned toward the class and said, "Would someone pick that up, please?" in the voice of a person who had nothing particular to say about a pencil tin on the floor. The girl in the front row was staring at her. She was not the sort of child who stared. She was quiet, careful, sat at the front because she liked to see the board. She was staring with the concentrated, uncertain expression of someone who had seen something they could not account for and was running back through the last 2 seconds trying to find an explanation. Tonks met her eyes and smiled. "I must have got chalk in my hair," she said. "It does that. Terrible nuisance." She pushed a hand through the front of it in illustration and turned back to the board. Behind her, she heard the tin being retrieved and the Thursday sounds recommencing. And when she checked the front row from the corner of her eye, the girl had picked up her pencil and was drawing a flower in the margin of her page. She taught for another 40 minutes and did not feel her hands at all. That evening, she sent a supplementary communication through the Covert Operations Registry to her handler. She described what had happened and when and how long the shift had lasted and how it had been corrected and what, if anything, the watching child had appeared to understand. She wrote, "Duration of aberrant presentation, approximately 2 seconds, involuntary, stress-triggered. Cover story deployed successfully. No evidence that the observing student drew conclusions inconsistent with the explanation provided." She wrote also, "I am aware that this incident reflects poorly on operational professionalism. I would prefer the assessment of continued deployment viability to be made by someone who can look at it clearly." She read that back, thought about deleting it, and sent it without deleting it. On Wisteria Walk, Tibbles was back from his evening round before 8. He had been covering the school's perimeter in a twice-daily circuit since September, and he had a reading to deliver. Arabella Figg sat forward in her chair as he communicated it. The elevated residue she had been tracking since September, the controlled, deliberate trace she had correlated with the young woman's presence at the school, had today acquired a secondary signature she had not seen before. Brief, 2 seconds. Distinct from the subject's chronic, accidental trace, distinct also from the careful, controlled magic she'd been cataloguing for 2 months. Not a charm or a curse. Not the purposeful, outward character of the confundus she had recorded in October. This was different in kind, involuntary, originating from within the caster rather than directed outward. A shift, suppressed almost as soon as it had begun. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the place between Tibbles's ears where she looked when she was thinking. A metamorph magus, slipping. She had considered the possibility in October and had not committed to it because the evidence was inferential. It was not inferential any longer. What Tibbles had brought home this evening was the signature of someone whose form had briefly and involuntarily altered. A rare and specific thing, different from the controlled precision of a sustained cover, because it had none of that precision. It had the character of a reflex, an accident. The cats now had that signature, distinct and catalogued, separate from everything else on the school grounds. She got up and went to the kitchen table where her writing things were kept, and wrote down what Tibbles had told her with the same care she brought to everything that mattered. In the flat on Spinner's Row, Tonks was asleep at the desk with her chin in her hand, the sealed formal report at her elbow, and the private notebook fallen shut. The cold cup of tea cast a long shadow in the lamplight across the page. By the first week of December, Amelia Bones had 4 reports on Harry Potter. She had read them in order twice, once when each arrived, and once now, in sequence, on a Monday morning when the ministry corridors were quiet and the interdepartmental paper aeroplanes had not yet found their stride. The 4 reports were laid flat on her desk in chronological order, 2 months of careful observation in a hand that was becoming, she noted, slightly less practiced looking. The newest one was the most detailed. It was also, in a precise and measurable way, the most troubling. She had pulled the full trace file from the improper use of magic office the morning the fourth report arrived. The folder was thicker than it had been in September, because she had not requested the full history the first time, and there was more in it than the 4 entries she'd read before. The 5th entry was dated June 1990. The Zoo. She read it twice. On Dudley Dursley's birthday, approximately June, the subject and his household had visited a zoo. A boa constrictor enclosure had experienced a glass dissolution event, proximate to an altercation between the subject and one Dudley Dursley. The snake had been reported as briefly ambulatory before Muggle witnesses, and the glass had then reappeared. The ministry had registered the trace, classified it as underage accidental magic, and noted in the margin that prosecution under the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery was not applicable. Children under 11 were exempt from the law, filed, closed, 5 incidents in 5 years, the most recent 3 months before term began. She thought about a 10-year-old boy standing at a glass enclosure with his cousin, and thought about what you had to be experiencing for the glass to disappear, and set the file aside with a deliberate hand. The 4 reports beside it were the operative work of someone who had arrived at St. Gregory's Primary School, knowing she was watching for welfare concerns, and had spent 2 months watching with increasing clarity for welfare concerns. The 3rd and 4th reports were significantly more direct than the 1st and 2nd. The 4th one contained the phrase, "nutritional provision at school lunch appears inconsistent," and separately, a documentation of winter clothing insufficient for the temperature. These were formal, measured words in an official hand. They were, nonetheless, the words. She picked up the departmental telephone and asked the extension to put her through to the authorizing supervisor of the Covert Operations Registry. The conversation was short, as these conversations tended to be. She proposed that a formal welfare inquiry be commissioned for 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, on the basis that 4 months of documented observation had produced evidence meeting the department's threshold for escalation. The authorizing supervisor was quiet for a moment. He did not disagree with her assessment. He had, she understood, read the same reports. He said he would prepare the paperwork. The memo arrived on Wednesday. It came through the interdepartmental system, an ordinary paper aeroplane in ministry blue, stamped with the minister's office seal. She unfolded it and read it standing at her desk. The Minister for Magic wished to draw the head of DMLE's attention to established ministry protocol regarding cases involving persons of significant public standing in the wizarding community. In such cases, it was the minister's view that decisions to commission formal inquiries, particularly those which might attract public attention or require contact with civilian households, should be referred to the minister's office before proceeding, in order to ensure appropriate communication strategy and public interest considerations were applied. The minister directed accordingly. He looked forward to continued productive collaboration with the DMLE. She set it down. She read it again, attending in particular to the words "significant public standing," which were doing an enormous amount of work in that memo. Harry Potter was 10 years old and had not chosen his public standing, and the ministry's interest in managing the communication strategy around his welfare was not, she thought, the same thing as an interest in his welfare. The memo had not, she also noted, cited a specific regulatory authority. It had described the minister's view and his direction. It had not cited the provision of law that gave a minister's view and direction precedence over an active DMLE welfare investigation. She was not aware that such a provision existed. She would need written clarification of the specific regulatory authority before she could respond to the memo accurately, because she could not formally comply with a directive whose legal basis she had not been provided, and she could not formally refuse a directive whose legal basis she had not examined. She wrote the request for clarification in 4 precise sentences. She noted that she awaited the ministry's response before proceeding. She marked the formal welfare inquiry paperwork as pending the outcome of that response and placed it in the departmental file where it would remain until she had what she needed to act or decline to act on explicitly documented grounds. The response to her clarification request would take time. That was fine. She had filed 4 reports, 5 trace entries, and 1 request for clarification. None of them were going anywhere. In little whinging, December had arrived with the particular grey determination of an English December that had committed to its position and was not interested in alternatives. The classroom had been decorated, paper chains strung from the ceiling, a construction paper wreath on the door, a window display of cotton wool snow that had migrated slightly leftward over the course of a week. The children had the distracted, partly elsewhere quality of children who knew term was nearly over and were spending increasing portions of each day in the mental vicinity of the holidays. She had been watching Harry Potter for 14 weeks. The end-of-term paperwork was stacked at the corner of her desk, and she completed it with the care she brought to all the official elements of this assignment, which was not the same as the attention she brought to what she was actually watching. He was thinner than he had been in September. Not dramatically, not in a way that produced a specific number in a report, but observably in the set of his shoulders under the too large jumper, and the way his face had the particular sharpened quality that faces acquired when they had been running on not quite enough for a sustained period. She had been documenting the clothing and the lunch provision for 2 months, and had been keeping a private note of his general presentation, and the note for December said what she could observe, and not what it meant, which was that a child who had been undersized and underfed in September appeared to be still undersized and slightly more underfed in December, and there were 2.5 weeks until the school broke up, and he went home. She taught the last lessons of the week with the routine competence she had built over 15 weeks. She marked the attendance register and collected the craft projects and cleared the display board of the November work and put up the December work and sat at the teacher's desk while the children were at afternoon break and looked at the private notebook, which was nearly full. She did not write anything in it. She just looked at it for a while, at the pages she couldn't see. On Friday afternoon, the last Friday before the final week of term, he helped someone else again. A younger girl had dropped her bag near the gate, and the clasp had broken, and the contents had distributed themselves across the path, and Harry had been 3 steps ahead of her, and had turned around without being asked. He had gathered most of it before the girl had sorted out what was missing, and had handed it back, and said something she couldn't hear from her position by the window, and the girl had said, "Thank you," with the emphatic sincerity of someone who meant it, and Harry had shrugged and turned back toward the gate. She waited until he was through it, and then wrote in the private notebook. He always turns around. She did not know whether anything she had written in the official reports was going to reach someone who could act on it. She had sent 4 reports through the secure channel and had no mechanism to know what happened to them afterward. The chain ran upward, and she was at the bottom of it, and what she had was the notebook and the classroom and 14 weeks. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag and went to stand at the window. Outside, the yard was empty, the December sky above the chain-link fence, the grey-white of weather that hadn't decided yet. 3 more weeks of term. She would be here for all of them. The second memo reached the handler's desk on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of December, and it differed from the first in one significant respect. This one was not a request. The first memo from the minister's office had deployed a language of concerned inquiry, A preference expressed, a direction indicated, the bureaucratic equivalent of a raised eyebrow. This one was shorter. The operation designated in the Covert Operations Registry under the attached routing code was suspended effective immediately, pending ministerial review. The operative was to stand down. The handler was to confirm receipt and compliance within 24 hours. The memo was signed by the minister's private secretary on his behalf and stamped with the official seal. The handler confirmed receipt, said what he was required to say, and stayed inside the authorized boundaries, which was in general a professional virtue. He wrote the compliance confirmation and drafted the stand-down order for the operative. Tonks received it at 6:30 in the evening, in the flat on Spinner's Row, via the secure channel she checked each night after marking. She read it twice, and then put it face down on the desk and looked at the wall. The instruction was clear. She was to stand down. The operative was to terminate their presence at the placement and await further contact from the handler, pending ministerial review of the operation's scope and authorization. There was no timeline given for the review. There was no promise that the operation would resume. The word pending was doing what it always did in these communications, which was function as a polite synonym for indefinitely. She thought about this for a long time. She still had 3 days until the last day of term. The school broke up on the Friday. If she was gone before Friday, there would be a gap, a substitute, a supply teacher, whatever the school arranged on short notice, and 30 children would arrive on Thursday morning to a classroom without Miss Williams in it, and most of them would not notice, and some of them would, and one of them would sit at the end of a bench at lunch, and it would not make any difference at all except that the person who had been watching and recording that fact for 14 weeks would not be there to write it down. And then the Christmas holidays would start, and Harry Potter would go home to 4 Privet Drive, and the operation would be in ministerial review, and nobody would be watching except Arabella Figg, 2 streets away, who was an old woman with cats and no wand. She got up and made tea, and came back and looked at the stand-down order again, and then picked up her DMLE reporting pad. She had never bypassed the handler before. The chain of communication was specific. Operative reports to handler. Handler reports to authorizing supervisor. Authorizing supervisor reports to the head of DMLE. She was at the bottom. Whatever happened at the top was not her business to influence directly. She had been clear about this in her own head since September. She was clear about it now. She wrote that down, too, at the top of the memo, because she wanted whoever read it to understand that she knew exactly what she was doing. I am aware that this communication bypasses the established chain of command. I flag it as a breach and accept the professional consequences. Then she wrote to Amelia Bones. She wrote 4 pages. She had never written to Amelia Bones directly before, and she was not certain Amelia Bones knew who she was beyond a routing code and a preliminary designation, but she addressed it by name and sent it through the same secure channel with a different destination code. She appended the 4 formal reports. She appended the private notebook pages, not the original, but a copy in her own hand, everything she had written in the faster, less official voice that she'd kept out of the formal file. The lunch observations, the clothing, the smile he showed when Dudley's group was on the other side of the building, the way he checked the room before he answered a question, the ankle monitor of social calculation he wore so automatically, he probably didn't know he was wearing it anymore. She wrote that she understood the operation was in ministerial review and that she was complying with the stand-down instruction, and that she was sending this because she was not willing for it to be the case that a formal investigation might be delayed or cancelled, and no one with the authority to act would have this information. She sent it, and sat at the desk for a while after, with the notebook open at the last page she'd written in. He always turns around. She had written that last Friday. She read it again now. Then she turned off the lamp and went to bed, and lay in the dark and thought about nothing useful for a long time. On Wisteria Walk, the second week of December had brought the pink flash signature again. Tibbles had caught it this time from a slightly different angle, closer to the school's east wall, which put the source perhaps 10 meters nearer the gate than the October position, and the reading was stronger for the proximity. Arabella Figg sat with her notebook open on the kitchen table and compared the two entries. October, confirmed metamorphmagus slip, duration approximately 2 seconds, correction immediate. December, same signature, duration comparable, same correction speed. The caster had been at the same general location both times. The interval between the two incidents was consistent with a person who was present at the school on a daily basis and had experienced a stress-triggered involuntary shift twice in 4 months. She had also narrowed the operative's home address to a range of 2 streets, not through the cats, but through the older method of walking. 3 separate occasions, always at a careful distance, stopping before the point where following would have required a commitment she wasn't ready to make. The 3rd time, she had tracked her as far as the junction of Spinner's Row, and the young woman had turned the corner, and Figg had stopped and noted it. She wrote the street name in her notebook and underlined it. She had sent a second letter to Dumbledore 2 days ago, updating the first. She was patient. 9 years had confirmed she could manage it. School broke up on a Friday. She watched Harry Potter come through the gate at 3:30 with his bag over one shoulder, and the carefully neutral expression he wore when navigating the 15-minute walk to Privet Drive without Dudley's group behind him. He was wearing the grey jacket. The sleeves were as insufficient as they had been in September. He turned left at the end of Mulberry Road, and she did not follow, because following was not her assignment, and Privet Drive was not her territory. He went home along the route he always took, and she watched him go until he turned the corner, and then she went inside. In the flat on Spinner's Row, Tonks was packing. Not much. She hadn't brought much. A bag, a spare set of plain clothes, the reporting pad, the private notebook. The desk was bare. The bathroom was as empty as it had been on the 1st of September. She had been in this flat for 15 weeks, and it looked like nothing had happened in it, which was the point, and which she was very good at, and which felt, this particular Friday afternoon, like the least useful skill she possessed. She didn't know if she was coming back. The stand down was in effect. The handler had confirmed receipt of her compliance. Whether the operation resumed after the ministerial review depended on a memo she hadn't written and a decision she had no part in. She had sent everything she had to Amelia Bones, and that was either going to matter or it wasn't. She had no further moves available to her. This was, she had been trained to understand, the nature of an operation in political limbo. You had done the work, and now the work was somewhere else, and you waited. She picked up the notebook last. It was full. She had bought it in the first week of September at the newsagent's on the High Street, a plain brown exercise book with lined pages, and she had written in it every evening for 15 weeks, and the last entry was from this morning. Last day of term. He had a school dinner. He ate all of it. He helped a younger child with their coat zip, which had stuck, before he went out into the yard. He doesn't know I watched him do that. He never knows. She put it in the bag and zipped it shut, and turned off the flat's lights and walked out. The walk to the bus stop took her past the end of Wisteria Walk. She didn't turn her head. The grey cat was probably there. She kept walking, bag over her shoulder, brown hair, sensible coat, the entirely unremarkable walk of a person going somewhere ordinary, which was the last useful thing she had left. The letters had arrived in the 3rd week of December, which was the week that Hogwarts emptied, and the corridors acquired the particular quality of space that only became apparent when it was no longer filled with children. Albus Dumbledore read Arabella Figg's first letter at his desk in the evening, with the fire doing its steady work in the grate and the various silver instruments on their shelves making their usual quiet sounds. And then he read her second letter, which had arrived 3 days after the first, and then he set both of them down and sat for a while in the manner of a man who has received information that requires proper consideration before he responds to it. He was 109 years old. He had, over the course of that considerable span, developed the capacity to hold several contradictory things in his mind simultaneously, without resolving them prematurely. This capacity had served him well. He employed it now. The first letter established a magical operative, almost certainly metamorphmagus given the evidence, had been present at St. Gregory's Primary School, Little Whinging, Surrey, since September. The cats had detected both deliberate adult magic and a metamorphmagus slip, twice. The second letter refined the location to a residential address on or near Spinner's Row. He had not arranged this. This was the element he returned to most carefully, sitting at his desk with the fire and the instruments and the December quiet. He had arranged Arabella Figg. He had arranged the Dursleys. Arranged was perhaps the wrong word. He had brought Harry to them, which was a different thing, though he was aware that the distinction was one he had grown practiced at not examining too closely. He had arranged the blood wards, which were not something he had constructed, but rather something that had constructed itself from Lily's sacrifice, and which he had recognized and invoked, and pointed toward Petunia Dursley's address like a compass needle toward its only viable north. He had done all of that. He had not arranged a ministry operative, which meant someone within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had done it without his knowledge, and had placed a young witch, the metamorphmagus evidence narrowed the candidates considerably, in the school where Harry Potter spent 5 days of every 7. And they had been there since September. The DMLE, knowing Harry's location, was a complication that carried its own weight. He had been careful for 9 years about who knew where Harry was. It was not that he trusted no one. It was that the remnants of Lord Voldemort's supporters had not dispersed cleanly, and the information that Harry Potter was alive and located at a specific address in Surrey was information that could move in unpredictable directions once it entered any official channel. He had not put it in official channels. He had given it to Arabella Figg, who was a squib with cats and a good head and no particular prominence in the wizarding world. That was the design. The blood wards required only one thing, that Harry live at 4 Privet Drive and be able, in whatever sense the ancient magic required, to call Petunia Dursley's home his home. They did not require good conditions at that home. They required presence and the particular quality of belonging that Lily's magic had tied to the act of Petunia accepting him. He had understood this from the beginning. He had placed Harry with the Dursleys and had asked Arabella Figg to watch from 2 streets away, and had not, in 9 years, arranged to know more than she reported. That Harry was growing, physically unharmed, no immediate threat from Voldemort's remaining followers. Those were the things he had asked to know. He had not asked to know about the coat, or the lunch, or the 2 seconds of smile that a 10-year-old boy allowed himself only when the geometry of a schoolyard confirmed he was out of his cousin's line of sight. What he knew was that a DMLE operative had been watching the same child with a closer view and a different brief, and that Arabella Figg was clever enough to have drawn the right conclusion from a magical signature, and that both letters on his desk were telling him that the situation had become more complicated than he had designed it to be. He returned to his desk and wrote to Amelia Bones. He indicated awareness of a matter of mutual interest involving an ongoing DMLE operation, and, as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, requested a private meeting at her convenience. He noted a preference for discretion. He sent it. Amelia Bones received the letter in the last week of December and replied the same day. She had been considering contacting Dumbledore herself. She wrote back confirming her availability, suggesting dates in January, and did not mention the chain of command breach memo she had read 6 times without acting on, or the question of why she had not passed the stand-down order along to the operative still nominally deployed at a Muggle primary school in Little Whinging. In the first week of January, St. Gregory's primary school returned from the Christmas holidays. The corridors had the returning from break quality that Tonks had been warned about by the actual teacher she'd displaced from this position, which was that the children were simultaneously more and less manageable than before the break, more settled by the familiar routines, less focused because they were still travelling between the holiday and the term. She stood at the classroom door at 10 to 9 and watched them come through the gate. Harry Potter came through at 8:53 with his bag over one shoulder and his jacket done up, and she looked at him with the professional neutrality she had been practicing since September and kept her expression where it needed to be. He looked. She assessed quickly and filed, thinner still, the jaw a little more defined, the green eyes behind the taped glasses doing their usual calibration of the yard before he walked further in. He had grown perhaps a centimetre over the holidays, which meant the jacket was now even further from fitting than it had been in December. He sat at his desk. She called the register. The morning proceeded with the particular January energy of a class that was back in rhythm, but not quite back at speed. At morning registration, Dudley Dursley arrived 6 minutes late and dropped heavily into his seat, and one of the children beside him moved their chair sideways in the instinctive accommodation that Tonks had been observing for 15 weeks. Dudley looked at his cousin once, briefly, and then looked at the board. Harry did not look up. It was at the end of registration that it happened. Dudley pushed back from his desk, not violently, not with any particular intention, just the normal push of a large child who takes up more space than he accounts for, and his elbow caught Harry's shoulder from behind. It was not a deliberate shove, but it had the effect of one. Harry lurched forward in his chair, and the chair went with him. Except the chair did not go forward. It scraped back. 3 inches, on the floor, without anyone's hands on it, a slow, deliberate slide away from the desk, and then it stopped. Tonks saw it. She was standing at the front of the room, and she saw it clearly, the slight, physical lurch of Harry's body forward, and the chair going in the opposite direction, as though something had decided the situation required the space and had made the adjustment without consulting the laws of motion. It took less than 2 seconds. Harry's hands came up to catch himself on the desk, and he straightened and settled and looked at the board, and nobody said anything, and the chair was simply where it was. She kept her face exactly where it was. She wrote the date at the top of the board, said the first lesson would start in a moment, and turned to collect the register folder from her desk. She set it down and opened the private notebook to a fresh page, and wrote 3 sentences without looking at the class. January. Registration. Chair. Observed it clearly from the front. No contact with the chair from anyone in range. Direction of movement inconsistent with force applied. She closed the notebook. Behind her, the classroom had the ordinary Tuesday sound of 30 children settling in. Harry Potter was looking at the board. She looked at him for a moment longer than she should have, which she would acknowledge later was not a professional error, but a human one. He had the same neutral expression he had worn since September, patient, contained, looking at nothing in particular. He did not know anyone had seen. He probably did not know himself what had happened, which was the nature of it, which was the whole nature of it. 10 years old, and already so practiced at not reacting that the chair had done the reacting for him. She turned back to the board and began to write. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning in the last week of January, in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Ministry of Magic that Amelia Bones had chosen because it was not her office, which meant that whatever was said in it would not be attached to her in the way that conversations held in one's own office always were. Dumbledore arrived first, which she had expected. He was a tall man, and in the particular way of very tall men who have grown old, he carried his height with a quality that was less physical than atmospheric. It was not that he filled a room, precisely, but that a room with him in it became a different kind of space. He wore robes the color of midnight blue, and his long silver hair and beard were arranged with the neat precision of someone who had been arranging them for a very long time. He sat across from her with his half-moon spectacles, and his expression of careful, interested attention, and she thought that whatever she had prepared to say to him, she should say it clearly and without ornamentation, because this was a man who would hear every word and all the spaces between them. She laid the 4 reports on the table between them. He read them in order, without haste. She watched him do it. His expression did not change significantly during the reading, which she interpreted as the expression of a man who was reading confirmation of things he had suspected, rather than news of things he had not considered. When he set the last page down, he was quiet for a moment. "The blood protection," she said, because she wanted to establish that she already knew, "is tied to Lily Potter's sacrificial magic. It requires Harry to live at Petunia Dursley's home, and to be able to call it his home. It cannot be replicated at another address. It lasts until he turns 17. He inclined his head, acknowledging this. "It does not extend to his school." "No," he said. "It does not require that the home provide good conditions. It requires that Harry be there and that he call it home." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone selecting their words with care. "That is correct." "And you placed him there knowing the Dursleys' characters?" There was a pause that contained several things he did not say. Then, "I placed him there because there was nowhere else the protection could exist. Petunia Dursley was the only family Harry had who could provide the specific anchor the magic required." He looked at the reports on the table, not at her. "I did not place him there because I believed the Dursleys were people who would treat him well." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "I understand the necessity of the arrangement. I am asking whether the necessity excuses the conditions." He looked at her then, and she met his gaze, and there was a long silence in the 4th floor conference room that held the question without resolving it. She had worked in law for 20 years, and she knew the particular shape of a silence in which someone was not going to give a clean answer because there was no clean answer to give. He did not tell her the conditions were acceptable. He did not claim the Dursleys were good guardians. What he said eventually was, "No, the necessity does not excuse the conditions. I am aware of what I chose." She gathered the reports. She had thought about what she was prepared to offer on the long walk to this building this morning, and she had thought about it the night before, and what she had arrived at was the shape of a compromise that she was not entirely satisfied with, but that she was satisfied enough with to propose. The DMLE reports would be sealed. No formal welfare inquiry would proceed, not because the evidence didn't merit one, but because a formal welfare inquiry into 4 Privet Drive would become a ministry file, and a ministry file could move, and the information that Harry Potter was alive and located at a specific address was information she was now aware required a particular kind of containment. The blood protection was not something she could dismantle, and she was not going to be the mechanism by which a child's only available protection was compromised by procedural visibility. Tonks would complete the assignment through the end of the school year. The evidence she gathered would remain in the sealed file, and the Dursleys would receive a letter. It would arrive through a Muggle-facing channel that she would arrange through means she did not intend to specify in any official record, not the Muggle-worthy excuse committee, whose remit was documented and did not extend to welfare correspondence, but through other means she had available to her that she would use and not document. The letter would appear to come from a Muggle local authority. It would indicate that the household had been flagged for a routine welfare review, and that the review would include a home visit, and that the reviewer would be attending on a date to be confirmed. The Dursleys were, by everything in these reports, the sort of people for whom a letter from an official body with the word "review" in it would produce immediate voluntary improvement in the conditions of their household. That improvement would include Harry. Dumbledore listened to all of this. His expression had the quality of careful attention she had identified when he sat down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You are doing a great deal of work inside a very narrow space." "Yes," she said, "I am." He agreed to the compromise. They did not shake hands. She collected the reports, and he rose and replaced his spectacles, and they left the room in different directions, and neither of them felt entirely clean about it, which was, she thought, probably the correct response to a compromise that preserved a necessary protection by declining to investigate a child's welfare. She was by the book. The book, she had learned over 20 years, occasionally ran out of pages. The cats found Tonks on a Tuesday. She was coming back from school in the early dark of a February afternoon, taking the Spinner's Row route as she always did, and Tibbles was sitting on the low wall at the corner of the street with the quality of deliberate waiting. She recognized it. She had grown accustomed, over 5 months in little whinging, to the particular intelligence of Arabella Figg's cats. She slowed. The cat held her gaze and didn't move. She looked up and saw the small figure at the far end of Spinner's Row, standing very still outside the door of the flat. She kept walking. She got her key out and opened the door, and the door opening caught her from the side. She had learned to expect it when she was tired, and her attention was on something else. And for 1 second, the hair at her left temple went pink before she brought it back. She had the door open and was looking at Arabella Figg, who was looking at the left side of her head with the expression of someone whose hypothesis had just been confirmed. "I think we should talk," Arabella Figg said. Tonks let her in. They sat at the small kitchen table with 2 cups of tea because Tonks had put the kettle on out of pure reflex, and neither of them had refused. Figg was a small woman with grey hair and reading glasses on a chain, and she sat across from Tonks with her hands around her mug and the particular quality of attention that Tonks had been watching, at significant remove, for 5 months. Up close, it was even more precise than she'd estimated. Neither of them shared operational intelligence. Tonks did not name the DMLE. Figg did not name Dumbledore. They did not discuss the details of their respective observations, or the contents of their respective reports, or the questions that their respective handlers had or had not answered about what was going to be done. What they established, in the careful and mostly implicit language of two people who were not going to say more than they had authorized themselves to say, was this. They were both watching the same child, had been watching him from two different directions for 5 months, and neither of them was doing it for a reason that was indifferent to whether he was all right. That was not nothing. It was, in the particular economy of what this year had involved, quite a lot. Fig finished her tea and stood and said she thought she knew the way out. At the door she paused and looked back, and what she said was, "He turns around. When someone drops something, he always turns around." Tonks looked at her across the kitchen. "Yes," she said. "He does." Fig nodded once and left. The door closed. In the flat on Spinner's Row, Tonks sat at the small kitchen table for a long time after, her hands around her cooling mug, thinking about a 10-year-old boy who turned around when someone dropped something, and the number of people who were watching him do it and writing it down in notebooks they kept separate from the official file, and whether any of it was going to add up to something useful before July, when he would turn 11, and the next thing would begin. The compromise held. No formal notice arrived rescinding the stand-down. What arrived, in the first week of February, was silence on all channels. And Tonks understood that silence from people above you in a chain of command meant either nobody had decided yet, or somebody had decided and preferred not to put it in writing. Either way, the classroom at St. Gregory's Primary needed a teacher on Monday morning, and Miss Williams had not been formally removed from the payroll, and she went. The grey cat was on the wall when she turned into Wisteria Walk on the Monday morning. She had been thinking about this since the kitchen table, since the tea, since the door closing behind Arabella Fig. She had been thinking about what a détente between two people who could not discuss their operations actually looked like in practice, and what it looked like, she had concluded, was probably this: the cat on the wall in the morning, watching her walk past. She stopped. "Morning," she said. The cat looked at her with the full force of its particular amber attention. Then it blinked once, deliberately, and looked elsewhere, and she understood that to be sufficient, and walked on to school. After that, she said good morning to it every day. It never responded with any great enthusiasm. She found she didn't mind. The term found its February rhythm, and then its March rhythm, and she settled into both. She had been Miss Williams long enough now that the name had stopped requiring any particular effort to answer to. It was simply the name she had, in this building, for the hours between 8:30 and 3:30. The children had stopped performing in front of her months ago, and were now simply themselves, which meant they were exhausting and occasionally surprising, and sometimes, in the particular way of children who were between 9 and 11 and had not yet learned to conceal things, inadvertently revealing. She marked their reading comprehension and oversaw their art projects, and did not look at Harry Potter any more often than she looked at any of the others, which was a discipline she had been practicing since September, and which had become, by March, nearly natural. The letter arrived at 4 Privet Drive in the 3rd week of April, in an envelope that appeared to have come from the local council. She did not see it arrive. What she saw was the change in Harry when he came through the school gate on a Tuesday morning in the last week of April, and she did not immediately have a category for what she was seeing, because she had spent 8 months calibrating herself to the particular, careful neutrality of his face, and the thing she was looking at now was different from that. He was still composed. He was still the boy who checked the social geometry before he answered a question, but there was something marginally less tightly held about the set of his shoulders, as though the thing that usually sat there had been temporarily lightened. She noted it and said nothing, and called the register and taught the day. She did not know what had produced the change until Arabella Figg sent her a note through a channel she had not previously used, and that Tonks suspected she had not previously disclosed because she had not previously needed to, which contained 4 words. Letter delivered. Bedroom given. She read the note at the kitchen table in the flat on Spinner's Row and sat there for a while. It was Dudley's second bedroom, full, she knew from the external observation, of Dudley's overflow. The toys that had ceased to divert him, the games in their new boxes, the things that had been bought and then installed because there was no particular purpose for them. A room of excess that had never been anyone's in any real sense. It was not a fine room. It was better than the cupboard under the stairs. Harry Potter was sleeping in a bed. She pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her finger and didn't let her face do anything, because she was alone in the flat and there was no one to see her, and that made it worse, not better. The letter and the bedroom were not justice, and they were not adequate, and they were what was available inside the compromise. And she was 18 years old, and this was her first assignment, and she sat at the kitchen table and was not quite all right for about 20 minutes, and then she washed her face and went to bed. May arrived with the particular impatience of a month that knew it was nearly summer, bright mornings, and the schoolyard warming up by afternoon break, the children restless with it. She had been at St. Gregory's Primary School for 9 months. She had 12 days left. She composed the final formal report on a Wednesday evening, with the window cracked open and the May air coming in. It was longer than the previous ones, not more elaborate but more complete, because she was writing something that needed to stand on its own in a sealed file indefinitely, and she was aware, as she wrote it, that nobody she knew of was going to read it and act on it, and that it needed to be the kind of document that could be read by someone who came to it cold. In some future she couldn't specify and understand immediately what it documented. She documented everything in order, the trace signature history from the UMO records as she understood them, the October roof incident, and her use of the Confundus charm, the clothing and the lunch provision across the full 9 months, the winter clothing deficiencies, the improvement to residential conditions in late April. She documented the classroom dynamics, Dudley's management of Harry's social environment, the specific behaviors that had accumulated over 9 months into a picture of a child who had been made to understand, by whatever means the Dursleys had employed, that the least visible version of himself was the safest one. She documented the AU accidental magic incident in January. The chair, 3 inches. No contact. Noting explicitly that it was an incident consistent with the documented canon pattern and not a claimed canon event. She documented the cooperation with the independent surveillance operative whom she identified only as an authorized watcher with a prior assignment to the same subject, because she was not going to put Arabella Figg's name in a file that might move even inside a sealed registry. In the final paragraph she wrote, "Subject completed primary school year in improved residential conditions. Accidental magic pattern consistent with expectations for untrained underage magical ability under intermittent stress. Welfare conditions, while improved, remain below the standard the department would ordinarily consider adequate. Operative's assessment, the subject's capacity to function within conditions that would significantly impair many children of his age, indicates a degree of adaptive resilience that this operative notes without, in the official record, offering interpretation." She read that back. Then she closed the official report and opened the private notebook to the last blank page. She wrote, "He is a remarkable child. I have been watching him for 9 months, and I am not able to say that with any professional distance, and I am done trying. He turns around when people drop things. He helps without being asked. He smiles when he thinks nobody can see him. He is going to Hogwarts in September, and he doesn't know yet, and I will not be there when he finds out. And I find I am mostly at peace with that, which I suspect means this assignment has cost me something I hadn't budgeted for, and which I will figure out later. She closed the notebook. The last day of term was a Friday in late May. There were paper chains again. The children had made them for the occasion, and someone had brought in a cake, which she suspected was the work of the teaching assistant who always remembered these things. She sat through the afternoon with the competent pleasantness of Miss Williams, reliable and forgettable, right up until the final bell when the children swept out through the doors in the joyful avalanche of an ending, loud and released, tumbling into the beginning of summer. She stood at the classroom window and watched them go. Harry went through the gate at 12 minutes past 3 with his bag on one shoulder. He did not look up at the window. There was no reason he would have known to. He turned left at the end of the road and walked in the direction of Privet Drive with his chin up, and the afternoon light was on him for a moment, and then he was gone. She did not say goodbye to him. That was not how undercover assignments ended. She turned and picked up her bag and left the classroom, and walked down the corridor and out through the staff entrance and did not look back, because that was also not how undercover assignments ended, and she was a professional. She said good morning to the cat on the wall anyway, that last morning. She thought it deserved that much. Harry Potter turned 11 on a Tuesday, in a bedroom that had been his since April. It was not a large room. It was not, in any sense that Harry could compare against other rooms he had been in, a particularly good room. It still had the ghost outlines on the shelves where Dudley's things had been, before they were moved to other parts of the house, and the curtains were a pattern Dudley had presumably chosen at some point, and now no longer had to look at, and the carpet had a stain near the wardrobe that Harry had not produced, and that no one had ever explained. But it had a window. It had a bed, a proper one, not the camp bed from the cupboard, and he could see the sky from where he lay. He had spent the first 2 weeks of April lying on the bed and looking at the ceiling. Not because the ceiling was interesting, but because the ceiling was something a person could look at from a bed, and looking at it from a bed in a room was different from not having either. By July he had mostly stopped noticing it, which he supposed meant it had become ordinary, which he further supposed was what happened when things became yours. The first letter arrived on his birthday in the Morning Post. He knew it was for him before he opened it. This was not a thing he could have explained precisely. The envelope was thick, heavier than ordinary post, made of a yellowish parchment that did not look like anything in the stationers on the high street, and it was addressed in green ink in a hand that gave the impression of having known exactly where he would be. Mr. H. Potter, the second bedroom, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He had it in his hand for approximately 4 seconds before Uncle Vernon appeared in the hall and took it from him. There were more letters the next day, and the day after that. Uncle Vernon's response to the letters escalated in the precise inverse proportion to the letters themselves. The more of them there were, the more routes they found into the house, the more comprehensively Uncle Vernon attempted to close every gap they came through, and Harry watched this campaign from a position of curious detachment, because the letters were addressed to him, and whatever was in them had his name on it, and the fact that he hadn't read one yet had not, as far as he could tell, stopped more from arriving. They were arriving from places that envelopes did not ordinarily arrive from. He did not dwell on this. He had, over 11 years, developed a relatively practiced relationship with things he couldn't explain. He finally read one in the 3rd week of August, on a Friday evening, sitting on his bed with the curtains closed and the lamp on, with the sound of Dudley's television coming through the wall and the letter open in his hands. It was from a place called Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and it said he had a place, and it provided a list of what he needed to bring. He read it twice. Then he lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought, for a while, about a number of things. The snake at the zoo 2 years ago, and the roof of the kitchen annex at school, and the time in Year 4 when his hair had grown back overnight, and the teacher had not been able to explain it, and he had not tried to. He thought about all of these things, and the letter, and the ceiling, and he felt something that he did not have a precise name for, which had the quality of something very large that had been in the room for a long time without being visible, and which was now simply there, and which was his. The large man arrived at the end of August. He was enormous, the biggest man Harry had ever seen, easily twice the height of Uncle Vernon, and several times the width, with a wild tangle of black hair and a beard that appeared to constitute roughly a quarter of his total volume. He wore a large coat with a great many pockets. He had a motorbike, though he had not arrived on it. He arrived with a cake in a pink cardboard box and the slightly apologetic air of a person who understood that their physical dimensions required some acknowledgement before anything else could be addressed. And his name was Hagrid, and he told Harry things that the letter hadn't, and he had a way of looking at Harry that reminded Harry, faintly, of something he couldn't place. Harry packed a trunk. The trunk went on the motorbike. He went with it and did not look back at the house, because whatever it had been to him, he was not going to look back at it on the way to what came next. The 1st of September was a Tuesday, and platform 9 3/4 was nothing that Harry had any word for yet. He stepped through the barrier behind the large man, and there was the steam first, rolling in from somewhere he couldn't see. And then the engine, scarlet, enormous, the red of something that knew it was meant to be looked at, and then the noise of it all, hundreds of people and trunks and cases and owls in their cages, and a smell of coal smoke and something sweet he couldn't identify, and somewhere in it all the sound of a whistle and a name called, and the feeling of moving forward into something that was waiting for him. He found a compartment. The train moved. England went past the window at increasing speed, green and grey, and October-coloured even in September, and he pressed his face a little closer to the glass, because he wanted to see all of it. Because it was his. Because he was going. He did not know, looking out at the English countryside from the window of the Hogwarts Express, that a year ago a young woman had stood in the classroom of his primary school and written the words. He sat alone for the entire lunch period, in a notebook she kept separate from everything else. He did not know about the notebook, or the reports, or the confundus charm cast in a passage outside the schoolyard in October, or the grey cat on Wisteria Walk, or the Thursday evening in December when a letter had been sent through a chain of command in the wrong direction, with a note at the top that said, "I flag this as a breach and accept the professional consequences." He did not know that 2 women had sat at a kitchen table in a flat on Spinners Row in February and established, without sharing any operational intelligence, that they were both on the same side in the only way that mattered. He just knew the train was moving and the window was full of England, and he was going. In a shared training office in London, an 18-year-old Aura trainee who had recently been assigned to a desk she described as optimistic in its dimensions, set down the daily profit and did not pick it back up again. She had been doing paperwork. She had a quantity of paperwork that bore no resemblance to what she had imagined the first weeks of Aura training would involve, which she had been assured was normal, and which she was managing with the particular tolerance of someone who had spent 9 months doing something considerably more difficult than paperwork, and could maintain perspective. The prophet had arrived that morning with the others, and she had set it aside, and then, At some point in the early afternoon, she had unfolded it and looked at page 7 and found, at the bottom right, a small item about Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry welcoming its new first-year class. His name was in it. Harry James Potter, among the other names, 3 lines from the bottom of a paragraph that was not about him, specifically, but which named him in the list of students confirmed to have joined the school's intake for the 1991-92 year. She looked at his name for a moment. Then she folded the newspaper and put it in the recycling and went back to her paperwork. And what her face did, she did not monitor, because she was alone in the office, and there was no one to see her. And this time, that was fine. In a restricted section of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's archive, in a filing cabinet that had been sealed by mutual agreement between the head of DMLE and the chief warlock of the Wizengamot in January 1991, there was a file. It contained 4 formal reports in a careful, unpracticed hand, a supplementary disclosure communication flagged as a chain of command breach, a set of handwritten notebook pages in a faster, less considered voice, and a final formal report composed in May 1991, which documented, in its last paragraph, a quality of adaptive resilience that the reporting operative had noted without offering interpretation in the official record. The cover sheet read, Harry James Potter, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, September 1990 to May 1991. Status: sealed. All was